Hi, my name is Dave Bode from joebono.com, bringing you this video exclusively for Audiotutsplus.com. What I want to talk to you about today is some tips and tricks that you can use when you're mixing live sound. Now, specifically, I want to aim this towards a particular size venue because whether you're mixing a really small gig or a medium-sized gig or a large gig, there are some audio practices that apply to all of those, have good signal to noise ratio, have great sounding sources. There are some things that in particular are a little bit different between all of those. In a really small kind of live sound situation, you'll be reinforcing the sound a lot less because you have kind of more noise that you're dealing with from the stage or whatever's making the noise. And so you're not going to be able to bring up the reinforcement of that a whole lot. In a medium-sized venue, maybe you're looking at between, 500, 700, 1,000 people, maybe even 1,200 people. There's still going to be a little bit of that kind of noise from the stage, especially if you're inside, but you'll be able to reinforce it quite a bit more than you will, at a smaller venue. And then when you're looking at kind of a large situation where you're up above 1,500, 2,000 people, and up, you're going to be mixing a lot of sound reinforcement in there, and there's the effect of the noise on the stage is not going to be as prevalent. I mixed an event a couple of weeks ago for my buddy Todd. He runs an organization called BASIC, which stands for Brothers and Sisters in Christ. And this is a college organization that has groups of college students that meet all across the Northeast United States. And then 2 times a year, they come together for a conference where there's music and speaking and the whole thing. And there's between 600 and 700 college students packed tight in a room. It's basically a room that's can just about hold 700 people. So I want to share with you some of my experiences mixing in that environment there. I've been involved in live sound for a number of years, and I've mixed at a lot of different places on a lot of different gear. And one of the things that I've noticed over that period of time is that there's kind of this phenomenon when you're mixing fairly loud music is that there can be a tendency for kind of a low, mid kind of frequency buildup. It almost sounds like there's something happening to the overall spectrum, which is muddying up the area between, say, like 200 hertz and around 500 hertz. And so what you end up doing is either tuning the system to where you're basically cutting that area out, or individual channels, you basically kind of do a dip around that region to compensate for this effect. And I read an article a few years ago, and it kind of explained why this happens. And it has to do with distortion in the subwoofer. When you have material that's in the subwoofer, say below 100 hertz, and that's causing some kind of harmonic distortion, it shows up between 200 and 500 hertz. Basically, this happens because you're driving them into the point where they start to distort. And so one of the ways that you can fix this is to have a lot of subwoofer headroom. 2 years ago, we were using 3 of these QSC KW 181s. And then we had a couple of dual 15 JBL speakers to kind of supplement. That didn't really work out super awesome. Then the next year we had 5, and then this past conference we had 7. And the difference wasn't so much in that we couldn't get enough volume, although we barely had enough volume 2 years ago. We had plenty of volume last year at the last conference that I mixed for, and we didn't really need any more volume, but what it did was it created some space in the headroom of the subwoofers. We had a lot more headroom to deal with, and so because of that, we weren't pushing the subwoofers into an area where they could get a little bit honky and a little bit distorted. And the difference was really quite astounding. Before, we were experiencing that phenomenon where we would get a lot of that kind of low mid distortion kind of buildup in those harmonics. And, we had a lot of bass power and sub power, but it didn't sound great. It was a lot of bass. I'm a guy who likes a lot of bass. And so it was a lot of bass, but it just wasn't very clear bass. It was kind of undefined, kind of thumps and honks and bangs and bumps. It wasn't really that great. Having a good deal more boxes to work with and more power available really made a huge difference, because it went from something that was kind of loud and unclear to something that was loud and pretty clear. You could hear very distinctly every single bass tone in the entire range of the bass guitar. The kick drum was very, very punchy and controlled, where before it was just kind of loud and woofy. Having those extra cabinets there really, really helped to clean up not only what the subwoofer range was doing, but in that lower frequency area as well. We weren't having to, make drastic cuts in that region as much because we had a good deal more power to work with. So if you can, having a lot more subwoofers at your disposal can be better. Not to have more subwoofer power, in volume, but it really, really helps clean up that area of the spectrum and the area above there where when you have less, you end up getting some distortion and a whole lot of junk in your mix. There's been a movement in the last several years to move towards in-ear monitor systems, which is great because if you reduce the amount of stage wedge noise that you have, you can clean up your mix a lot. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but if you're mixing a band that is using stage monitors, and if you turn off the mains and measure the sound that they're generating, when they're in one of their bumpin' songs, it can be a tremendous amount of sound. I've measured between 86 and 90 decibels back at the mixing console from the noise of the guitar amplifiers, the stage monitors, and the drums all put together. And that creates a lot of junk in your mix. It's all kind of reflected sound, reflecting off the walls and the ceiling. And so it's all getting to you and everyone else in the audience at different times. It can create a lot of kind of audio destruction. And so any way that you can reduce that and still keep the musicians relatively happy will drastically affect the quality of your mix. It'll make things sound a lot clearer, a lot brighter, a lot more intelligible. We were fortunate enough to be able to use little personal monitor mixers for everyone. That helps clean things up a lot. And then another thing that I like to do is try and work with the guys who have amplifiers on stage to see what we can do to kind of tame that down. And now, guitar players, for some reason, love to have their amplifiers pointed at the back of their knees. I don't know about you, but I don't have ears on the back of my knees, so I don't hear very well there. So what I've found is that a lot of guitar players, they tend to kind of learn their guitar sound like that, where, they're not hearing the direct sound right off the center of the cone beaming up to their ears. They're kind of hearing this more kind of dull sound that's being reflected a little bit. And that's the kind of sound that they may like. But here's the thing. If the guitar player is not using their amplifier to cause feedback with their guitar, they have it close and they're, holding out chords and causing feedback, there's not really a good reason for them to have the amplifier on stage. For one, it'll bleed into everybody else's microphone, especially on a stage where you don't have a lot of space. In this particular situation, they initially set up the guitar amplifiers right next to the drum kit. They were within 4 or 5 feet of the snare drum microphone. And at the level that they run their amplifier, you can definitely hear that in all of the drum microphones, the overheads, the tom mics, the snare mics, and any other open mics that are on stage, vocal mics and stuff, that's going to pick up. So all of a sudden you have a lot of bleed. And the other thing is that guitar speakers, little 12-inch kind of low mid drivers, are very, very directional when it comes to those upper mid frequencies. They essentially come like a laser right out of the center of the cone. And so if you have the amplifier pointing at the back of your knees, it's basically going to be pointing right at the faces of the people in the front few rows that are standing directly in front of it. And this can create a face melting type effect because it is unbelievably painful to stand in front of a guitar player who's got his amp cranked and you're getting that high mid, real nasty stuff. And it's not a pleasant experience. So what I like to do is kind of work with the guitar players, find out what they're going to be doing and have kind of a relational conversation with them. Not something that you'd stand back at the mixing console and say, hey buddy, turn that thing down. Not something like that. Have a conversation with them and explain the situation. We're kind of getting the mix dialed in back there and we're finding that we have enough guitar level without having to push it up in the speakers at all. And so that's not really going to work very well because the type of sound that is coming off of your guitar amplifier by the time it, fills the room is very dull and kind of nasty sounding. So, we can hear it, but it's not the right sound. So work with the guitar player to get the volume down on their guitar amplifier so that it's still producing that great tone that they like, especially with tube amplifiers, but so that it's at a controllable level. And then if we can, we'll see if we can move the guitar amplifier to another location In this particular case, we moved it off of the stage, basically in back of the stage behind, and we put it on the floor behind the curtain, and that helped cut down the noise dramatically. And for them, they're essentially getting the same experience, especially if they're using ears. They're still hearing it from the microphone being piped into their ears, so their sound is essentially unchanged. But it made a dramatic difference to the front of house sound, where we could cut down that stage noise dramatically. We tried to do the same thing with the other guitar player's amplifier, and that worked as well. A couple other things on the mixer side of things that can really help clean up a mix are high-pass filters and dynamics. These are things that shouldn't be unfamiliar for anyone who's done any recording, but in a live sound reinforcement environment, there's a lot more kind of energy in the room. You know, you're working with high levels of volume, and so the dynamics of some particular instruments can get really out of hand, especially like vocals. You know, vocals always need to sit right at the top of the mix so that you can hear what they're singing. That's the point of singing a song, is that you have to hear the vocals. So if they're kind of riding at the top of the mix and then they really jump into that microphone, you know, it can bump up 10, maybe 12 decibels or more. And so if your mix is already riding at, 95 decibels, now you've jumped up the mix to 107 decibels, and that can be pretty painful, especially if you're measuring that at the back of the room or, 75 or 100 feet back from the stage, closer to the stage where people are going to be closer to the speakers. That's going to be even louder. And so that can get into kind of ear damaging territory. I like to use compressors on every single signal, but I like to use them for kind of peak management, where at low and mid levels, there's not a lot of compression, maybe, just a tiny bit, if any. Then when they get to those kind of upper dynamic passages where the level can spike up, I like to have the compressor kick in there to really kind of clamp it down. And I like doing this as opposed to kind of having it being compressed all the time, and, kind of generally squashing the level. I like to have, some room to breathe in there, with the low and medium level stuff. And then when it gets up into that kind of upper register of, really kind of shouty vocals, to have that kind of be really clamped down. And so that can keep things in check a lot better. And that works well for vocals, background vocals, lead vocals, electric guitar, just to kind of knock down the spikes a little bit. For things like keys, synth, piano, and bass guitar, you might want to have more of a sustaining type quality to the compression, where it kind of latches on and then it has a bit of a slower release, maybe around 100 milliseconds, somewhere in that neighborhood. So that can help there. And then drums, drums need a lot of compression to keep things in check as well. So I like to have everything nice and compressed, not heavily compressed, but more like kind of peak management, similar to what you do in a recording situation. But some of those instruments can get dangerously high to kind of ear damaging levels if you don't, keep things in check with the compressors. The other thing that can help dramatically is using high-pass filters. Now, this is something, again, that's very familiar with people who've done recording, but in a live kind of sound reinforcement environment, you're dealing with a lot more energy, a lot more kinetic energy, especially when you're talking about the subwoofers. I like to run aux-fed subs so that only the things that we want going to the subwoofers goes to the subwoofers. And this is very different than how a lot of studio monitors are set up, where they're set up to be full range speakers. And so the things that you need to end up in the kind of sub range, you put in there by allowing those frequencies to kind of come through. And so when you run aux-fed subs, you kind of do the same thing, but if they're not in that particular aux channel, then they don't even end up in the subwoofers. It doesn't matter what frequency the high-pass filter is set to. And this way you can really control the kind of low-end energy where, you maybe only want bass, guitar, and kick drum in there, or if it's a really slow song, maybe some synth or pads or something like that. Or if there's like an opening act or like some kind of special act and they have an acoustic guitar, you might want to throw some acoustic guitar in there as well, especially if they're doing like a drop D tuning or something of that nature. But in general, you don't want any of the other instruments in the subwoofers. You don't want vocals. You don't want electric guitar, definitely. Maybe you want some low tom in there. Almost definitely you do, but not any of the other toms. And in general, you want to keep the keyboard, the piano out of there to really tighten up that low end mix. But in addition to that, there's some frequencies maybe near the crossover point of your subwoofer system that can get a little bit muddy if you're not kind of using that high pass filter. So I like to make things sound a little bit thinner, like the electric guitar, the keys, and the vocals, to really open up a lot of space for that kick drum and that bass guitar to live in. Things that if you heard them by themselves, they would just sound too thin and unappealing. But when you fill up the mix, or you fill up the room with a lot of kind of kinetic energy, a lot of sound, and a lot of subwoofer, those things can sit a lot better in the mix if you run your high-pass filter just a little bit higher than maybe you normally would in a recording type situation. That's especially true of like electric guitar. You know, a lot of times if you're having a full kind of open chord on electric guitar and you have those low beefy notes in there, it can sound pretty awesome to put those in the subwoofers or even the low mid frequencies. But as soon as you get them in there with anything else that's in that same spectrum, whether it's like pads or bass guitar, it becomes just complete mush. And so using those high pass filters can really help clean things up a whole lot. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff that we can go over, but I want to leave you with one final thought, and that is to know your gear and how it's set up. Instead of getting there and trying to figure out how everything's going to be plugged in, I actually take time to make like a giant map of where every single input, where every single output is going to go, from the speaker controllers, the effects, all of the rack gear, and that really helps be able to set up, because you can just give it to somebody and say, look, this is the input list from the stage. Go ahead and plug it in. And, someone who has even some reasonable intelligence can say, okay, kick drum, I see that kick drum here, and then, plug it into the right slot. And that can really help speed up your workflow when you're setting up, and also to help you troubleshoot problems, because, even after you set up, a relatively involved kind of sound system where you have a number of main speakers and a bunch of subwoofers, crossovers, speaker controllers, a snake with 32 sends and 16 returns. If something goes wrong in the moment, you have to kind of rifle through your brain to figure out which input goes where and exactly how you connected that. And if you're doing the same gig over and over and over, this can become pretty easy. But if a lot of things change, and if you're moving around to venue, these things can become a little bit tricky to kind of remember, okay, where was the fourth return from the snake getting plugged in? Is there a problem with that? But if you have like a little map or something, that can be really helpful. And that's come in handy a lot of times. Now, I was able to pass that out to a number of people, and they were able to look at it, and setup went really quickly. We had people running the snake who, normally didn't really understand how to do that, and, connecting it in at both ends. And basically all I had to do was make sure that they were doing it properly and kind of focus on some other stuff. So I hope those tips really help you to have some great sounding shows and to have shows with as few problems as possible. Thanks so much for checking out this video. Again, my name is Dave Bode from JoeBono.com, bringing you this video exclusively for Audiotutsplus.com, and we'll see you around.